Not without reason, many students in higher education complain about the lack of effective teaching in those institutions. While the discussion of the purpose of universities forms a separate topic, the complaint itself certainly brings into focus the difference between teaching and learning. At its root, any education below the university level is essentially teaching, where the burden is on the educator to bestow the knowledge effectively to the students, whereas in higher education, the process is lecturing or perhaps transmitting, and the burden is on the pupil to effectively receive the information from the educator. Why is this? And should it still be the case? Traditionally, there was not necessarily an assumption that a student would go on to higher education or necessarily even finish their high school education. Becoming a functioning member of society a little while back, not even that long, and taking a decently lucrative job didn't necessarily require that kind of learning for a typical citizen. For reasons we discussed in another video, this presumption has changed, and so that at this point, if a high school graduate wants to forego higher education and either jump into a possible blue-collar job or something like that, or enter a trade school or an apprenticeship, it's considered an outlier. It's deviating from the standard path in many places and communities, at least, and almost needs to be justified to some points of view. And as I said, it's not necessarily true of all parts of society where it is perhaps more common, but there is often an assumption across different parts of society, or even across society as a whole, that higher education forms a natural part of a young person's educational process, and that skipping or avoiding this would be truncating your academic career unnaturally. With a child, even through high school, there's no supposition for the individual to want to learn. No one expects even a high school teen to be emphatic about spending their entire day in the school building, taking very great care to learn everything that the teachers have to offer. It's the natural, assumed responsibility of the educator, of the teacher, to ensure that the information gets imparted to the student as well as is practically possible. But on the other hand, when a student chooses to further their own education, they're taking it on themselves to learn. The focus then shifts to the student, with it becoming their responsibility to take advantage of the resources, in the sense of educators and whatever other resources are provided for their disposal by the university or other institution to gain the information they want. So why do we draw that line at the university level? Obviously, a lot of it has to do with historical context and the fact that there could be considered to be a demarcating line in terms of what it takes to enter the workforce, such that as a society we say we only need to provide you this core education to get to the point where you can enter the workforce, and if you, student, wish to further your education, get a different kind of job that requires higher education, more fine-tuned education, specific to some subject, then that's on you. We see this also in terms of how we fund education. While there are state-funded colleges and universities, obviously this takes a greatly different form than primary secondary education. This is true, of course, in the United States, where this debate is ongoing, but it's even true in countries that are known more for free university, where the story is often not quite as straightforward as that, even if it works out that way in principle for the typical individual there. But the more that a society advances, or as we seem to be advancing in a certain direction, and as we get a greater and greater need, or apparent need, for people en masse to undergo higher education, and as discussed in another video, as the very nature of higher education changes, there is also a corresponding need perhaps to re-examine this line between teaching and learning, initial education and continuing education, the fundamental requirements of being ready to enter the workforce versus learning something extra so that you can find a specific place in the workforce that you prefer. Does that mean that the line doesn't exist? Does that mean that we should push the line all the way to the possible ends of formal education, a master's program, a PhD, a fellowship? It's easy to argue that while the farther you go in education, the fewer people will necessarily need to pursue it that far, that we might still say it benefits us as a society to help those students learn, gain knowledge that they need to, that they want to, that perhaps they're paying for. If we invest in the education process, even in those institutions, we stand to gain students who learn faster, better, more correctly, and come out of those institutions with an effective education in the thing that they're attempting to learn. These are all positive points. Does that necessarily then put the burden on society to be able to do that for them? Or just on the institution to be able to provide educators who are capable of this? Or then again on the educators themselves who, knowing that they're going to be lecturing to individuals who are going to at some point enter society and perform certain tasks and jobs, that they ought to be able to perform their task well and therefore deserve a high quality education where the burden is perhaps more on the instructor than on the student. But there's one other quirk here, and that's in the sense of the fact that while there is not a stark line, there is a fundamental difference in how an adult pursues their education versus how a child pursues their education. You don't necessarily reach your 18th birthday right as you hit your college years. There are a lot of factors that go into exactly when you graduate, exactly when you start. But the presumption is that when you've entered college, you're entering a new phase. And while you're still subject to certain restrictions of the university, perhaps of your parents' household, you are more so a free individual to pursue whatever ends seem appropriate to you, which is not something that is true for children under the age of 18 who are still subject to the constraints of what society would dictate for them. There's sort of an unstated notion that while we allow children some freedom and put some restrictions on adults, that before someone hits their 18th birthday, it's correct and understandable to put a higher level of restriction on them to attempt to form them into the mold that we believe is best for society. And obviously that will be shaped by the individual instructors and the individual parents and so on and so forth. But there's a general societal understanding of this. And that plays in very strongly to the education process, where we say, in effect, sit down, listen, take notes, learn. We are going to give you what you need to be prepared. And this changes fundamentally. When someone says, I now have what I need to enter the workforce, I now have what I need to be an adult, hopefully. It's not always successful as that, but that's the idea. But now I am choosing what I am going to do with my life, whether I want to go and get a job straight away, or whether I want to attend a university and gain higher education, or whether I want to hike around Europe for a year, if that's what the case is. We say, well, if you can afford to do whatever the thing is you're trying to do, that's your business. And therefore, the next step is not the institutions to make, or the parents to make, or anybody else's to make but that individual, that person who has now turned 18, entered the next stage of their life. And so perhaps it's only natural and correct that the onus then be on the student to perform the action of learning. We can be there for the student. We can help the student. We can provide a framework to the student. They're still new at this. And we should do all those things. But in the end, if a student chooses to continue their education, it is as an adult, and it must be an action taken as an adult. Now, we could at some point move that line. If 100, 200, 500 years from now, let's say we're living 50 years longer on average to 130 or something like that, and we don't consider anyone educated properly unless they have had a full education to what we would now consider a PhD or farther. Anything less than that, and you're just not ready to enter society. Society is just too complex. There's just so much to know. Then we might shift the line. It might have shifted naturally by then, but there'll be a necessary shift where perhaps you're not an adult truly until you're 30, 35. In some ways, it already seems like the mental state is heading that way. We extend our natural learning processes. There's still some cultural division there, but it seems to be a growing trend. So imagine that this is the case, but only much more so. And the individual reaching, let's say, their 35th birthday has undergone a higher level of education, and now is considered prepared to enter society. It's not fundamentally different than what we do now. It's only that we have shifted the line, the starting point, because of changes in society and the level that we expect a normal education to adhere to. And the way we can apply that here and now is by understanding that this process is to be expected, and demanding on the one hand that our education be up to par and the resources made available be high quality resources, and certainly not flaking on any of that front, but at the same time recognizing that the student, once they have reached whatever we currently define as upper education, higher education, past the standard minimal limit to enter society as a functioning adult. And that will always be up for argument, and that will always be a dynamic notion, and that's what makes it such a difficult conversation. But we can at least identify that and say that right now this is roughly where we draw the line, and therefore it is on the student to take these resources that we as a society are attempting to give them in the best way we can, but they must perform the action of learning. That is the critical element. That is the difference between teaching and learning, between lower education and higher education, between childhood and adulthood. We do no great service to a student if we handhold them into adulthood. On average, there are always exceptions. But making sure that we're aware of that line and having this conversation about where that line is will continue to be an important aspect of how we handle education moving into the future. And so while it is more comfortable in some ways to say this line does not exist and we should be teaching better, and certainly we may take lessons about how to teach better, and every educator should be interested in teaching effectively, we must still recognize that the line is there for a reason.